Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Interdisciplinary and Transdisciplinary Studies, SOTS, Bachelor of Arts, Philosophy, BAFP. BPYC 101 Introduction to Philosophy, Perspectives, Issues and Early History. Block 2 Indian Scriptures, Philosophy and Aim. Unit 4 Indian Scriptures. 4.0 Objectives. In this unit, you are exposed to the sources of ancient Indian culture. However, the study material excludes prominent texts like the Vedas, also called Shruti, sources of Buddhism and Jainism, since there are other units reserved for these sources. This unit, therefore, includes only the followings: Smriti, mythology, Vedangas and epics, Mahakavyas. Since they only belong to the periphery of philosophy, mere cursory reference will suffice. 4.1 Introduction. The word Smriti means that which is in memory. The texts which are called Smriti appeared in written form at the initial stage itself. The age of Smriti followed the age of Vedas. Since the Vedic period stretches to several centuries, it is also likely that Smriti might have appeared during the closing period of the Vedas. Consequently, all Smritikas, the author of Smriti, claimed that their works drew support from the Vedas and also that their works are nothing more than clarifications of the Vedas. However, we can easily discern in Smritis a lot of variations from Vedas. Evidently, such deviations do not get any support from the Vedas. 4. To the subject matter of Smriti is also known as Dharma Sastra, which means code of conduct. The code of conduct has three divisions: rituals, discharge of social responsibility, and atonement for sins which include crimes. It is important to note that there is no mention of rights fundamental or any other kind. The emphasis is upon prescription and proscription only. The code of conduct is identical with the Constitution, and so it is the same as the penal code formulated by the present-day governments. Hence, Smriti emphasizes two aspects of life: dharmic and social. The former does not simply exist without the latter. The role of ritual is restricted to individual life, household life to be precise. All these dimensions together constitute Dharma Sastra. Though it is claimed that there were several SMTIs, history has recorded only a few. Among them, only three are well known, sometimes for wrong reasons. Vidhi and Nisedha were codified by three persons: Manu, Yajnavalkya, and Parsara, and consequently, the SMTIs were named after them. A cursory reference to these SMTIs is enough. An important aspect of Smriti is its rigidity. Fixation of duties and emphasis upon duties resemble, to a great extent, the directive principles enshrined in the Constitution. While fourfold division of society is one type, fourfold division of individual life is another. Smriti is very clear about not only four classes, but also four stages: Brahmakarya, Grahasthya, Vanaprastha, and Sannyasa, in the life of an individual. There is no scope for switching from one position to another in a random manner. The last division, viz., atonement for sins, deals precisely with this sort of prohibited switching. The upshot of this discrimination is that liberty took back seat, but stability in society was prioritized. This will help us to infer the kind of political system which Smriti supported. Surely, Smriti did not support democratic system, though during Vedic age democratic system flourished. 4.3 Mythology. Mythology and history in India, it is claimed, are indistinguishable. Mythology in Sanskrit means Pura. This word has two slightly differing etymological meanings: Pur, past; Attam, lost; Angtam, about to happen, is one meaning. Pur, past; Bhavam, happened, is another. In terms of structure, Purana consists of 5 components. They are listed as follows: 1. Description of nation or nations and their history. 2. History of creation. 3. History of recreation. 4. Description of dynasties. 5. Story of each Manu, Manvantara. First and fourth components do incorporate elements of history. However, there is a vital difference. History follows a certain method and therefore, at some point to time or the other, it is possible to dispute what a historian claims because history tries to gather as much evidence, not facts, as possible. Puras, however, are altogether different. The relevance of evidence is totally alien to Puras. It is, therefore, impossible to refute what Puras claim. Nor can we defend the same. Puras are 18 in number. Since they are not relevant philosophically, it is not even necessary to list them. In addition to 5 components mentioned earlier, many Puras deal with cosmology. Perhaps this is the only topic common to philosophy and Puras. Interestingly, one Pura, viz., Viewpura, attempts at geography, music, etc. Apart from the neglect of evidence, Puras suffer from one more defect. All Puras combine legends related to gods and demons, life after death, etc., which disqualify mythology from becoming worthy of serious philosophical study. In defense of Puranas, it can be said that though Puras are related to mainly theological issues, they include almost all activities of life and hence they ought to occupy an important position in the list of disciplines. But this all-inclusiveness itself is a serious defect. 4.4 Vedangas. Vedangas are also known as Adangas, which means 6 organs. The function of these 6 organs is to explicate the intricate thoughts of the Vedas. Those organs are SK with Macron, phonetics, Vyakra, grammar, to be more specific, Vedic grammar, Chandas, prosody, Nirukta, etymology and dictionary, Jyotia, astronomy, and Kalpa, rituals. It was believed that proper understanding of the Vedic texts is possible only when all these organs are strictly followed. 2 extraordinary characteristics of the Vedas form the background of these organs. In the first place, the Vedas were held to be apauruseya, independent of man. Therefore, no change in any form for any reason was admissible. Secondly, it was also believed that the Vedas should be taught and learnt only orally. Consequently, it took several centuries for Indians to put the Vedas in writing. Without going into the merits and demerits of this particular prescription, we should examine the role played by Vedanga in protecting the Vedic tradition. Shiksha Sya, in his Ajivedabhya, has defined Sikh as follows: that which teaches pronunciation in accordance with swara, vowel, and varna, letter, is called Sikh. Clarity in speech and ability to listen correctly are the prerequisite to learn the Vedas. This is the reason why the Vedas are also called Anusrava, that which follows listening. The emphasis upon clear pronunciation is perfectly understandable because due to the unique structure of the Vedic language, which is the most primitive form of Sanskrit language set by very different grammar, even the slightest variation in pronunciation could lead to total change of meaning. Vyakra, Chandas and Nirukta. These 3 organs are not unique in the sense that the role, which they play with regard to the Vedic language, is very much similar to the role of grammar or dictionary in any other language. Since no language is possible without grammar, Vedic grammar must be as old as the Vedas. If the Vedas are a apauruseya, then the Vedic grammar also ought to have been apauruya. However, it is not the case. Among the extant works of grammar, Panini's work Adhya is the oldest one. It is said that this is a 4th century AD work. However, earlier Vedic dictionaries mention other Valikras. Since the dictionary is more ancient than Panini's work, it is obvious that other Valyakra's works are more ancient. The mention of these aspects shows that grammar is Pauruseya. Hence, language should be Pauruseya. However, one grammarian by the name Shaktyana maintains that even grammar is a Pauruseya. According to him, the oldest work on grammar is Indra Vyakra. It is named so since, according to the legend, men received it from Indra. The source of prosody is Chandas Sutra by one Pingalkriya. Nothing is known about this author. This work includes both Vedic and non-Vedic prosody. Generally, the Samhitas are bound by definite prosody. Only Yajurveda and Atharvaveda Samhitas are occasionally prosaic. Hence, prosody occupies a prominent role in the study of the Vedas. Payne says, Chanda Pado tu Vedasya, which means prosody is the very foundation of Vedas. In course of time, the Vedic language itself became prosody. The Vedic prosody has one unique feature, which is mentioned by Katyana. He says, Yat akra parimam tat chanda. It means the one which determines the number or quantity of letters, that is prosody. It should be noted that this is not the case with secular Sanskrit. It is said that the latter evolved from the former. The Vedic prosody consists of what is called pada or quartet. Generally, a quartet is supposed to possess 4 letters. This, perhaps, became a characteristic at the later stage because there are 11 principal prosody, which differ not only in the number of quartets, but also in the number of letters in each quartets, whereas Trishtup Chandas consists of 4 quartets with 11 letters in each of them. A prosody may differ from another as regards the pattern of quartets. For example, Kakub Chandas have 8 letters in the first and third quartets and 12 letters in the second. This difference shows that there is a little freedom here which is conspicuous by its absence elsewhere. Nirukta provides the meaning of the Vedic terms. In the first step, terms were collected which constituted a dictionary. However, mere synonym or lexical meaning would defeat the very purpose of compiling terms. Nirukta does not provide just this sort of meaning. What it indulges in is hermeneutic exercise. Hence, it is more than any ordinary dictionary. Let us start with the structure of the dictionary. A lexicographer, by name Yaska, collected these terms and provided the most authentic interpretation. The dictionary consists of all 1770 terms spread over 3 kandas. First kanda consists of 3 chapters, which is called Naghantuka. Second and third, consisting of 1 chapter each, are called Nagma and Devta. Nirukta is an interpretation of these terms mainly, and to some extent he has quoted some mantras and interpreted the same. Nirukta itself consists of 14 chapters, of which the first 6 chapters deal with Naghantukaka and Nagmaka, and the next 6 chapters deal with Devta Kanda. Last 2 are somewhat like appendices. Jyotisa. Jyotia astrology, or sometime known as astronomy, evolved in ancient India out of necessity. Yajnas could not be performed at the discretion of anyone. In the strict sense of the term, it was seasonal. Every Vara, except Sidra, had a fixed season to perform yajnas. Taittiriya Brahma spoke so: Vasante Brahma, Brahmin during spring, Agnimdadhita, ignite holy fire, Grmirjanya, Kshatriya during summer, Datta, Sardi Vaisya, Vaishya during post-monsoon, Datta. Igniting holy fire is very important because only it ought to set any program in motion. Not only was season important, but also exact time of starting yajnas was important, for which it was necessary to track the movement of not only the sun but also all celestial bodies. Most important among them are 27 stars. This could be done only with adequate knowledge of astronomy. Kalpa Sutras. Kalpa Sutras are so called because whatever material is provided by them is all in the form of formulas. The explanation Kalpa Sutras is the same as that of Brahma Sutra, Alpakram, brief, Asandigdham, unambiguous or incontrovertible, Sarvat, complete in essence, Vishwato Mukham, all inclusive. Kalpa Sutra literally means action, indicating formula. Action is of four types: Sarota, Garhya, Dharma, and Sulbha. The last one differs, more or less, in type from the rest. Hence, let us consider it at the end. The first three are common to K, Yajur, and Sama. But all three Kalpa Sutras differ from one Veda to another as regards prescriptions and scope. For example, Svalana and Sankhya Sutras of G Veda cover all three Kalpa Sutras. Since every class of sutra has distinct commands, they constitute rituals. Let us consider each kalpa separately and represent membership using tables. Table A. Sarota, Asvalana, Sankhyana, Aji Veda, Katyayana, Shukal Yajurveda, Bodhyana, Apastamba, Satyadha, Ka Yajurveda, Vaiknasa, Bharadvaja, Manva, Arseya, Samaveda, Vetna, Atharvveda. Table B. Grihya, Asvalana, Sankhyana, Aji Veda, Paraskra, Shukal Yajurveda, Bharadvaja, Apastamba, Ka Yajurveda, Bodhayana, Gobhila, Khadira, Samaveda, Jamini, Kaushika, Atharvveda. Table C. Dharma, Vasista, Rigaveda, Bodhyana, Apastamba, Ka Yajurveda, Gautama, Samaveda. Dharma sutras pertaining to Shukla Yajurveda and Atharvveda are not extant. Master was founded by Askalma. Let us examine what these sutras are about. Svalana Sutra was founded by Asvalana, a student of Sonka. Likewise, many sutras are known after the names of the founders, just as many laws and theories in science are named after scientists like Newton's laws of motion, etc. All Sarota Sutras specify the manner in which yajnas and yagas have to be performed. They are essentially prescriptive, which do not allow any room for deviation. The very fact that there are several Sarota Sutras, which subscribe to different Vedas, indicates that there were several ways in which yajnas were performed. Two aspects deserve mention. Yagas were performed solely with the motive of reaping worldly benefits. Second, man was ineligible to perform yaga in the absence of his wife, which means she enjoyed equal status in the ritual. Garhya Sutras prescribe household duties. The point to be noted is that all Garhya Sutras agree on one particular count, i.e., what ought to be done. But they differ on another count, i.e., how it ought to be done. No Garhya Sutra disagrees, for example, with the relevance of, say, marriage. But they disagree with the manner in which it is to be performed. Secondly, all four sutras are complementary to each other. So there is neither choice nor contradiction. To fulfill his obligation, one has to perform all rituals in the manner prescribed. The rituals pertaining to Garhya Sutras are of two types. One type of ritual has to be performed only once in life. In some cases, there are exceptions. Second type of rituals has to be performed every day or once in a year. There are 16 such obligations which are called Shodasha Samskaras. There are 4 classes of such samskaras: samskaras to be performed before birth, after birth, to begin the learning of the Vedas and to prepare man for marriage, etc. It should be noted that there are separate samskaras for men and women. It is not necessary to consider all these samskaras. What is important is to know the manner in which they were followed and qualifications which were held as necessary. The characteristic of these samskaras is that they were, or are, not regarded as common to all varnas. Two types of discrimination are well known. One discrimination is varna-based, i.e., Brahman, Kshatriya, etc. Second discrimination is gender-based. The first category of discrimination eventually led to the caste system. It, also, might have resulted in hierarchy. Secondly, gender-based discrimination provided an upper hand to men of higher classes. In a way, actions were inconsequential insofar as higher class men were considered. But it was not so in the case of women. One argument is that women, like Sudras, or men, like Sidras, were denied education because they were not entitled to some crucial samskaras. It is insignificant that men were not entitled to some samskaras to which women were entitled because this limitation did not really affect men. But it not so in the case of women. One particular samskara deserves special mention. Brahmopdesa, for example, is not permissible for Sudras and women, even to this day. It is this particular samskara which makes Brahman caste, in particular, a distinct caste. It also explains why Brahman is called Dvija, twice born, after the completion of this samskara. It is said that before this samskara is performed, Brahman is not a Brahman at all, and so this samskara is supposed to give second birth to him. Surely, even within the framework of Chaturvarnya, fourfold varnas system, this particular argument is not endorsed by all. The fact that the argument, being referred to, is at variance with some established or accepted norms set by Smritis was totally ignored while speaking about Brahmins. Our purpose, surely, is not go into the merits and demerits or Chaturvarnya or caste system, but to demonstrate structural changes which took place in belief systems, perspective in which age-old customs came to be understood, and consequently rapid changes which affected the society, because this is what precisely happened over centuries in Indian society. If we consider the literal meaning of the word samskara, then it becomes evident that it is meant to uplift man or woman spiritually. It is argued that they also produce other classes of positive results, physical well-being is one. If so, why was a certain class or classes denied this benefit? It is not possible to discover any answer to this question within the framework of philosophy. A psychologist or sociologist may throw some light on such questions. In spite of the fact that samskaras were spiritual in nature, the ulterior motive behind adherence to them is mundane. It is very easy to discover in the samskaras some spiritual support, if not any foundation, for all aspects of earthly life. For different reasons, the samskaras did not receive support from the Upanishads and heterodox systems. The Upanishads disapproved of the samskaras because the goal was this worldly. The heterodox systems strongly reacted to the samskaras because they claimed affinity to the Vedas. Despite differences in their philosophy, both the Upanishads and the heterodox systems adhered to life in the monastery. Their apathy to anything connected with earthly life is behind their antagonism to the samskaras. This discussion also brings to the surface an important fact that philosophy and religion do not coincide always if religion is understood as dharma. While samskaras stand for dharma, the dharma. While samskaras stand for dharma, the Upanishads stand for philosophy. Kaushika Sutra of Atharvaveda is unique because this sutra does not deal with any type of spiritual matter unlike previously mentioned suras. It throws some light on herbal plants and thereby it helps in understanding the ancient system of Indian medicine. There is a sharp distinction between Garhya Sutras and Dharma Sutras. While Garhya Sutras regulate man's actions which are restricted to family, Dharma Sutras have societal leaning. Gautama's Dharma Sutras appear to be the earliest one. These sutras specify not only the obligations within the framework of Katavarnya, but also Raja Dharma, the duties of rulers. In Indian context, morality is essentially based upon what the Dharma Sutra specifies. Hence, the limits and defects of Dharma Sutras have distinct bearing on the acceptability of moral principles. Last one to be considered in this section is Ulba Sutra. Though this sutra also is relevant in the context of performing yajnas, it is restricted to geometrical aspects only because in the absence of adequate knowledge of geometry, it was impossible to construct the Vedic atlas. Ulba Sutra is an example of primitive technology developed by ancient Indians to meet the demands of ecclesiastical dimension of life. 4.5 Epics. Though the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are two epics which have influenced literature for several centuries in all parts of India, the Ramayana is not significant philosophically, unlike the Mahabharata, and we are not concerned with the literary value of these two epics. So it is sufficient if we notice that the Ramayana accepts the principles of Sanatana Dharma and duties of rulers in particular. Since there is nothing philosophically new in this work, we need not consider it. It will serve our purpose if we concentrate on the philosophical component of the Mahabharata. Logic and epistemology, which constitute any philosophical tradition, have nothing to do with us when we study culture, literature, etc. The Mahabharata is not an exception. We can trace, however, to philosophical issues in this work. One is expounded in the Bhagavad Gita. Second one is morality and polity expounded by two prominent characters, Vidura and Bhisma. But these philosophical issues in this work suffer from a serious drawback from philosophical point of view. Nowhere in this work do we find discussion or criticism, which is the hallmark of philosophy. More than anything else, what we find is only a sermon. Therefore, a brief reference to these elements is enough. The moral philosophy of Vidura. From the point of view of ethics, it is desirable to regard some characters as personification of virtue. Vidura and Bhisma belong to this category. In contrast to these characters in the Mahabharata, we have other characters which are regarded as personification of evil. Why should any epic portray evil characters? This is one question. Are they, in a broader perspective, really evil forces? This is another question. The second question is much deeper philosophically and cannot be answered easily. First one is slightly easier to handle. An epic must be vast. Hence it ought to include all facts of the world and all aspects of life. So, evil characters ought to find place in any epic worth the name. Vidura's exposition of moral principles begins with a clear distinction between Sreya's action between Shya, desirable, and Priya's, pleasing. He compares Sreyas with medicine which is not palatable. It is immediately followed by a second analogy to demonstrate the status of pleasure which is invariably accompanied by evil. To make this concomitant relation explicit, Vidura compares pleasure with honey, pleasure seeker with one who collects honey, and evil with abyss, and says that the pleasure hunter is busy only in seeking honey, unmindful of impending danger of falling into the abyss. In the Mahabharata, Vidura plays his role on 3 occasions. On the second occasion, Vidura plays the role of a counselor. His counseling has a moral base. He makes an explicit distinction between 2 states of mind, those of wise man and ignorant. While Plato speaks of 4 cardinal virtues, Vidura speaks of 6 cardinal vices. Greed is one among them. He makes out a case for a wise man by listing the remaining vices: lust, anger, irrational attachment, arrogance and jealousy, which he does not possess. There is no need to describe the personality of one who is free from these vices. Indeed, it is very interesting to note that Vidura concurs with Plato when he describes an ignorant person. He is the one who neglects his duty but tries to perform what is not his job. Secondly, he cannot distinguish between a true friend and enemy. All qualities attributed to an ignorant person can be found in Thrasymachus, who indulges in violent attack on the ideas of Socrates. At the end of this particular session, Vidura makes a list of 10 commandments in which one commandment is identical with Plato's classification of men into three classes: guardians, philosopher kings, soldiers, and artisans. Both of them argue that these three classes ought to perform duties assigned to them only. It means that justice, according to Plato, and dharma, according to Vidura, consists in every man doing his own duty, and this is the cardinal principle of welfare state. This is the essence of Vidura's moral philosophy. In the last session, Vidura talks of death and the need to accept the same. Death and fear are nearly inseparable if man does not accept that death is inevitable. In this context, Vidura accepts reality, i.e., human nature, and maintains that man hardly follows wisdom. There is striking correspondence with what the Buddha says, ta with Macron, desire is the cause of misery, and remedy consists in the realization of truth, and that is knowledge of philosophy. In this respect, Vidura, the Buddha, and Plato held an identical view. It is precisely in this sense that in Indian tradition philosophy always was regarded as a way of life. Bismarck's political philosophy. There is a sharp difference between Western model of political philosophy as understood and practiced today and the ancient Indian concept of polity. The difference essentially consists in shift from one end to the other, i.e., from rights to duty, with duty as the focus of sermon. Even democracy, the most liberal form of government, prioritizes duties of citizens in spite of the fact that every citizen is entitled to fundamental rights. There is absolutely no gainsaying in holding the view that directive principles form the backbone of any democratic setup. Bismarck's advice to Dharmaraja Yudhishthira, on the other hand, provides a very different picture. He specifies only the duties and responsibilities of the ruler with no mention of the duties of citizens. Against this backdrop, it becomes obvious that in real sense, a citizen is the king and ruler is his guardian. Several centuries before Plato visualized the role of guardians, the Mahabharata portrayed king in a similar fashion. Bismarck's lecture not only explicitly mentions the king's qualities and duties but also it is the first ever treatise on public administration. Let us consider these aspects briefly. King should be proactive, truthful, and straightforward. According to Bismarck, these are the most important qualities of a king. He should be compassionate but not too soft. It is interesting to note that Plato starts from the other end but arrives at the same result. According to him, guardians should be given moderate physical training coupled with music lest they will transform to beasts. The essence of Rajdharma is safeguarding the interests of citizens. In fact, Bismarck lists 36 qualities in an ideal king which are necessary to follow Rajdharma, without which the citizens do not receive protection from the king. Foreign policy is another aspect of public administration. Foreign policy involves two forces, enemies and friends. The role of friends is not much highlighted. But he emphasizes that the king should know how to deal with the enemy. Prudence is always the guiding force. Bismarck makes it very clear that war is not the solution. Nor did he mean that the enemy can be spared. Constant vigil, concealing one's own weakness and proper judgment only can ensure safety and security. All these descriptions apply under normal circumstances, whereas in distress even enemies should enjoy compassion because a humanitarian treatment may destroy enmity. Ultimately, humane outlook scores over other considerations. The Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita, Song of God, is a part of Mahabharata. It is a sacred and one of the most revered Indian scripture, which comprises roughly 700 verses. The teacher of the Bhagavad Gita is Lord Ka, the Divine One. The content of Gita is the conversation between Ka and Arjuna, which took place on the battlefield before the start of the Kurukshetra war. As soon as Arjuna saw his cousins and loved one before the beginning of war, he started to face a confusion and moral dilemma about fighting with them. Consequently, Ka reminds and explains to Arjuna his duties as a warrior and prince. Meanwhile, Ka elaborates on different yogic and Vedantic philosophies. Thus, it is often being described as a concise guide to Hindu theology and also as a practical, self-contained guide to life. Gita is also known as Gitopanishad, implying its having the status of an Upanishad. Since the Gita is drawn from the Mahabharata, it is classified as a Smriti text. However, those branches of Hinduism that give it the status of an Upanishad also consider it a Shruti or revealed text. As it is taken to represent a summary of the Upanishadic teachings, it is also called the Upanishad of the Upanishads. Three features are prominent in the Gita: knowledge, social obligation, and devotion. The confluence of these principal features constitutes what is popularly known as yoga. There is no need to consider here its role in life, which the Gita has explained. What is important is its position in philosophy. But there is no reference to its philosophical foundation anywhere in the Gita. For example, consider devotion, bhakti. Devotion is sensible only when dhakta is distinct from paramatam, not otherwise. In other words, the refutation of the Advait is a prerequisite to accept the relevance of bhakti. But nowhere do we find any reference to Dvaita or Advait in the work. On the contrary, the Gita concludes by merging obligation or karma and knowledge in bhakti. However, one point becomes clear from the Gita: no one can attain moksha if he or she renounces this world. Renouncing the world is tantamount to renouncing obligations. Hence, in defense of the Gita, one assertion can be unhesitatingly made that the Gita does not prioritize spirituality at the expense of worldly life. However, neither the charge that it does not do so nor the counter charge that it does is philosophically insignificant. But this point is mentioned because attainment of moksha in relation to karma has primary origins in the. Let us drop bhakti and concentrate only on karma yoga and jnana yoga. While jnana stands for realization at the highest level, karma assumes a very different meaning. During the Vedic age, karma meant only performing yajna. But in the Gita, it has come to mean social obligation. Yoga came to be understood as dedication. Hence, karma yoga may be understood as discharging duty with a sense of commitment. The most important element in the Gita is the doctrine of nikma karma, which consists in discharging obligations in an impersonal manner. This attitude literally debars yagas because one performs it with selfish motive. The Gita, however, never advocated that karma should be renounced. What it clearly asserts is that karma phala should be renounced. It only sidelines personal interest and upholds societal interest. Thus, individuals become the means and society the end. An impersonal approach to duty does not affect the performer in any manner, i.e., neither success nor failure affects him or her. This attitude is samantva manobhava, equanimity of mind. It is necessary to clarify the relation between the meaning of karma and vara. At this stage, Katavarnya, fourfold classification, becomes relevant. Translated into ordinary language, it means commitment to profession. Turvaryam Maisa Gokarma Vibgasa, Gita, 4:13, it means guna, quality, and karma, profession, determine varna. To this statement we can add another: quality determines profession. Commitment to profession is what dharma is. The Gita makes a clear distinction between commitment and interest. Commitment is impersonal, whereas interest is personal. Vested interest is well known. But there is nothing like vested commitment. When vested interest affects an individual, one may resort to prohibited means. But impersonal commitment does not result in this sort of selection. The maxim, ends do not justify the means, is implicit in the Gita. One more aspect should be noted here. In fact, there is a mistaken notion that there is hierarchy in profession while it is not the case as far as the Gita is concerned. However, there is a distinction between good and bad or constructive and destructive. It is good to discharge duty which is in conformity with one's own nature, otherwise it is bad. Clearly, there is division of labor, and it is in the interest of society that such division is made mandatory. Therefore, qualitative distinction in profession is strongly disapproved. Thank you for watching. We will see